This talk, Lou's going to tell us about the lines that exist between gaming and non-gambling online, and explore games that exist in the gray area. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Lou Castle. Thanks, Lou.
Hello, everybody. Oh, thank you. So thanks for coming out so early after what I'm sure most people was a late night. So appreciate that. Welcome to the gaming track, the gambling track, I would say, the casino track. So this talk is really, I always like to start off with a little bit about who I am and what I've done, given a little bit there. But I'm a video game guy. Started a company back in the early 80s and was doing that up until about 2009. And then got into web-based applications with Instant Action, doing game streaming. Some pretty neat technology stuff that never actually quite came to where it was, but something very similar called Gaikai came out, so to give you kind of context of what that is. Then I was briefly the vice president of studios at Zynga for the better part of a year, and working with Mike Verdu and some folks there, and got a real education when it came to big data systems and scalable systems, which was pretty interesting. And then was stepped off the board of Shufflemaster. I was on the board of directors for 6.5 years, and then stepped off the board to become the chief strategy officer. And what a chief strategy officer at Shufflemaster was a created position. I ran all of R&D, and I ran mergers and acquisitions, and created the iGaming business for Shufflemaster. So those three kind of prongs. So a pretty good chunk of what normally a CEO would do for a public company. We created almost $1 billion of value in just under 18 months for our shareholders. Unfortunately, I worked my way out of a job by selling the company. So that's why Castle Production Services. I'm actually in a period where I'm non-compete in the gambling industry. The contact that I have here, the context of this talk has already been approved, but otherwise I can't really do much in the gambling industry. I'm contracting for a couple people that are non-competitive. And I'm starting off on video games and doing some, I'm a registered investment advisor and starting an advisory fund, but that's totally unrelated to the games industry. So this talk is really about my experiences as a game maker, as a video game, social video game creative leader, and as a real money gambling online and physical space, and where the kind of lines and regulations are. And so that's what this is all about. There's some pretty good takeaways if you're in either the social casino space or in the real money space. So talk outline is we'll talk a little bit about what is by the sort of definition of the law gambling. I think I missed that point too. I am not an attorney. I'm not giving legal advice. That's always the disclaimer. But this is really me as a businessman. I've always worked with a good staff of attorneys, so I'm sharing some of that knowledge with you or some of that experience with you. So definition of gambling, what is what is not gambling? You'd actually be a little surprised, I think, and so we'll talk about that. Reward-based and what it means when you're doing gaming of some sort where you're giving a prize, because that's actually comes into the definition. The different ways that the world does regulation. While I was at Shuffle, we sell to 3,000 casinos around the world. I carried about 260-something gaming licenses for real money gambling. So if any of you have been through the gaming license process for one jurisdiction, you can imagine what it's like for that many. So there's a very big difference, a kind of really fundamental difference in the way that the United States looks at gambling and the rest of the world looks at gambling. Types of wagering, I think that's relevant to all the things we'll get into. That gets into categories. And then finally, problem gambling, responsible gambling, because those are kind of the disclaimers I think even in the social space we should be paying attention to, because we don't want the government regulating us any more than they already are. And then finally, gambling companies and how the market's moving. So moving right into it, this is this is the sort of Wikipedia wagering definition of gambling. And I'm not going to read it out loud because those are boring slides when you have somebody read your slides. But it comes down to this. This is the big concept. The big concept is if you have these three things, consideration, chance, and prize. So if you take money, have some sort of chance, and then give money back everywhere in the world, absolutely, you are gambling. Okay? And from that point, that absolute certainty, everything else is gray. There really isn't, there aren't really hard and fast rules past that. But when you look at this, you have to start thinking about what are the basic permutations of this, right? So sweepstakes has no consideration. So sweepstakes is basically no purchase necessary. You've heard that on television a million times in the United States. It does have chance and prize, and there are a lot of very specific sweepstakes rules that are governed by state in the United States. So the United States, one of the ways it differs from the rest of the world is the federal government doesn't regulate gambling. I think everybody gets that. But because of that, sweepstakes is a bit thorny and a bit tricky as well. Generally speaking, there's 28 states where it's really easy. You get to about 40 where it's pretty similar, and the last 10 or so it's very funky and weird. And you can do it in all 50 states, but you have to be pretty careful about how you do it and how you collect the data, what you do with the data, et cetera. And I'll get into that. Skill-based wagering is really easy too. You have consideration. You're taking money, and then you have a prize. Any kind of contest of pure skill is completely in this category, and it's not gambling. And then you get into the sort of argument of what's skill, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. In the purest sense of the word, if there is no chance, if it's completely deterministic, something like chess, clearly skill. If you have something like backgammon where there's a dice element, arguably it's gambling, arguably it's skill, and that's where the gray area comes in. And then typical social games, and this is interesting. I say typical social games, and this is one of the big takeaways. So hopefully everybody in this free-to-play space can understand or grasp this clearly. So far, Zynga, which I was proud to be a staff member of at one time, consideration and chance, but they don't give you any prize. Money goes in, money never comes out. And in fact, nothing that even resembles money comes out when it's in its purest form. And that's how we think of the safe area of social gaming. But I hypothesize that there's actually another way to do this. So let's talk a little bit about the components, and then we'll see what I'm talking about. First, consideration. The original laws of consideration come back from England, and it's even a peppercorn. So consideration can be anything. Generally speaking, as long as consideration is money, you've got the attention of gaming regulators and the law. If it's not money, now you're in that kind of gray area again, right? So, and I represent each of these as a gray. The peppercorn being kind of on the white side, anything absolutely zero value, definitely not even a peppercorn, you're on the white side. If you go all the way to the dark side, as it were, you're taking money, you have consideration, right? Pretty straightforward. Typically, even $1 can be considered good and valuable consideration for purposes of contract law. And so you've got to be a little careful on consideration side. Chance versus skill, again, I talked about this. Dice, an excellent example. There's all chance to that. Chess, no chance at all. And then finally, prize, or something has to be, is it valueless? A virtual currency that can't be converted into anything in the real world probably is valueless. I say probably. It's about as white as you get. On the other side, real money, clearly very, very valuable and obviously prize. So here's what's interesting. Who decides what this is? And this is where we get into it's the governments, it's the regulators, it's the lawyers, agencies, commissions, trade people. It's all of the agencies, and the old joke, we're from the government, we're here to help, right? So that's who decides what is gambling. And the interesting thing about that, and part of the nuance of this talk, is that because it's different in the United States, state by state and country by country, it's not as hard and fast as you might think. And if you're not from the gambling industry and you're from the video game industry, you can often be very confused because you might read a regulation and say, well, my game fits in that regulation, so it's okay, or there's no way they can prevent me from having a license, and those are all absolutely false. If you believe for a second that you know exactly what gambling means, you have to immediately quantify that or categorize that into, or limit it to a very specific jurisdiction, a very specific product, a very specific thing. And by the time you get to all of that, you really are at the behest of all these different governments. And strangely enough, all these sovereign nations, tribal nations, all these different countries, they oftentimes change their regulations simply for the purpose of changing them. There's no other reason. So they might look at another jurisdiction, they'll adopt most of what they have, and they have a big committee meeting, and they decide they just want to be unique. So I warn you, as a video game company, if you've never been in gambling, Byzantine does not begin to describe the gambling industry, especially online gambling. It's just incredibly complex. And fundamentally, the reason they do all of this is to protect their citizens, but I think it's probably so they can collect some taxes, but maybe I'm a little cynical. So sorry about popping that. So rewards-based gaming. So rewards-based gaming asserts that there is no prize, therefore no gambling occurred. Remember those three things: consideration, chance, prize. This is actually a pretty naive position when it comes to gambling. I kind of touched on the fact that gambling is a very fuzzy and kind of hard to define thing because it's different in lots of different places. And so if you're in a social casino space, which is what this is, all this is about, believe it or not, you're in a very gray area just to begin with. there are many places in the world, and I can point to them in Alderney and in the UK and other places, that are seriously looking at this as regulators saying, that looks a lot like gambling. It walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. I think it might be gambling. And so I think it's important for the social casino. It's social games in general, by the way, even something as sort of non-gambling we think of as like an Invest Express game, like a Cityville or a Farmville. In some ways, you could make the argument it's gambling, right? And so I'm going to get into why that is. And I'm not making that argument, I'll be very clear, but I think you need to be aware of how the regulators view the world. So the reason that you don't hear a lot of people passing legislation against social games and stuff is because right now there is no perceived threat to existing businesses, and I just don't think most of them have woken up to the fact that there's potentially a big tax opportunity there. But unfortunately, I think one day they will. And you've already heard noise, I think, if you look around the world, that people are trying to figure out how it is they can take those social casinos and somehow figure out how they get their piece of that, or at least regulate it, or control it, make sure that the games are fair, et cetera. So it really is, this actually gets into my little point here, which is in many territories around the world, social casino or social games in general are considered addictive. And I'm going to get back into addictive in a minute because that's an interesting term as well. They're already being reviewed for responsibility in Europe. And here's an interesting point. The social gaming space has some very big companies, billion-dollar-plus companies, the Kings of the world, the Zyngas. But those companies don't work well together in a lobbying effort to protect their industry because they don't perceive it as an industry. Let me flip the table around. In the gambling industry, they absolutely work together on legislation to protect their industry. So you need to be thinking about the fact that companies with gambling licenses that also want to play in the social spaces, and there are a lot of them now. Back when I started giving talks like this, there were only a couple. Those companies have a vested interest to make the bar as high as possible for anybody else to get in their industry. That's just their business model. They have all these regulations, all these taxes they have to pay. It's to their best interest to make the bar very, very high. So on the one side of the table, you have people with lots of money and resources that are already used to regulation who would love to see, and they may not say it publicly, but the truth is the industry would love to see social gaming regulated, right? At least almost all of them. Some maybe not. Some may have more open views about that. But the vast majority of them from a business point of view, and I'm not talking about the individuals, I'm talking about from a business interest point of view, it is in their interest to regulate that industry because they already have to go through regulation. It's already a hurdle they have to cover, so why not? And that would be to their benefit. So I do warn, and I'm saying this so far, it hasn't happened, but I do believe that it's coming. At some point, you're going to have a government come out against social casinos or against online activities and say that that's gambling. And right there with them is going to be the gaming companies saying, yes, we think it is. Right, at least a lot of them. And the gaming industry, by the way, doesn't act in one concert either. I don't want to paint that. We have people like Sheldon Adelson saying online is evil, and other people like the actual association saying we think it's great. So they're very of different minds. But when it comes to the benefit to the industry, it's clear their benefit would be through regulation. Now, I said it before, we might be doing gambling when we do social casino or even social games. And that's because if you look closely at the prize, is that really the missing element? Are we really missing prize, right? Because anything that can be converted to cash is a prize, we don't really think of virtual currency that can't be converted as cash as being risky. But really, you might be surprised at what some jurisdictions in the world consider prizes. Even the idea that somebody was to get a trophy or something like that could be considered a prize. So I think we need to be a little careful as an industry, as a social casino industry or social gaming industry, games being video games, to make sure that we're clear that the prize that we give for those activities is not something that's going to be perceived as push us into the world of gambling. Yeah, so it's a great question. Comps in MyVegas, it's actually later in my slide, so I'll get to it. If I forget, please remind me, but I will get to it. So let me go back for a moment just to regulatory approaches, because I said before they're very, very different. And I'll come back to the prize issue, because it's all gets bundled together here. In Europe, gambling started really in the backyards, attics and such, and there was quite a few people that were maybe a little on the certainly notorious and maybe even nefarious side of things, and the games were not necessarily regulated or safe or anything else. And the industry evolved, and over time, it happened almost all around the world, but in Europe especially, it was allowed to continue to evolve. It was never tried to be shut down. And eventually, you got gaming regulators involved, you had fair games, and it literally matured into an industry that had a fairly good sense of, yes, it's a fair game, yes, I'm not going to get ripped off, the big operators are following some sort of rules, there's government bodies that are regulating it and all that. But because of that, and because of the way the European Union is structured, each individual company has a sort of God-given right to offer gambling as a product as long as they meet the requirements. And the requirements are set by the various jurisdictions. Now, that's very, very different from the United States. And this is the fundamental difference. In the United States, it's a privilege license. In the United States, any state that has a gambling license, whether it's land-based or online, can just simply look you in the face and say, we don't like you. And we don't need to give you a reason. We don't want you to have a license. Sorry. Now, in Europe, you would immediately sue for some sort of defamation or unfair practices. Even if a country tells you you can't have gambling in Europe, you can always go to the EU and argue that you have a right to do business in that country, just like the guys that are in the country. And unless they're very careful, like Italy, Spain, France, and they've even gone through their difficulties, unless they're very careful, the companies really do have a right to do it. And this sets up the fundamental massive difference between gambling in the United States and gambling in Europe. To illustrate the point, there are people in major companies in Europe, and I'm talking about the big boys, the ones that are publicly traded, they're considered pillars of their industry, they advertise on sports networks, that can't go into some jurisdictions because they will be detained and questioned. And they have been detained and questioned. In the United States, if you were ever detained and questioned for illegal activity, I guarantee your license would be pulled. And once it did, in one place it'd get pulled in all of them, because no gaming regulator in the United States wants to have the taint or the stain of a potentially illegal or of questionable character person in their industry. In Europe, they're like, look, you can detain me if you want, but you can't arrest me, and if you do, I'm going to sue the country. They'll literally violate the rules. The regulator says, we don't want you here. They'll walk in there and say, we're going to do it anyways. You just can't get away with that in the United States. And that's what sets up this whole argument. And when you hear about the poker stars and the purchases by Amaya and all that, part of the reason that the American companies are kind of aghast sometimes at some of the European operators that are in the United States, even today, is because not too long ago, 5 or 6 years ago, if you had asked any of them if any of these companies could possibly get a gaming license in the United States, they would say, absolutely not. I can't believe it. This guy was detained by a government in Belgium and he was held for 48 hours. That happens in the United States, you're out. So there's no way the United States is going to give them a license. Well, not so much, right? And the reason that is because, politically and financially, New Jersey, and I'm going to defend the New Jersey regulators here because some of the regulators say, hey, look, they did the things by the rules in their country. We're not going to hold that against them. Now, other regulators said, hey, bad actor clause, California, sorry, you're bad anywhere, you're bad. We don't want to have anything to do with you. And this is the debate. And it's going to be a constant fight. There's anybody who tells you for sure, PokerStars is in the United States, they can't be sure. Anybody who says for sure they're not, they can't be sure either. And the answer is probably some places and probably not other places. So be careful about the generalizations because there is no generalization in the US market. So wagering, I think this group especially, I give these I always like to cover these, but I don't think any of these are going to surprise you of the various types of gaming. So I'm probably not going to spend a lot of time on the slide. If anybody has a question about it, I'll come back to it. But I think I also talked about each of these two. Parimutuel, and really this is about, in the United States, we would call them classes of gaming. I don't call them classes because it just becomes very confusing because a Class 2 game looks like a Class 3 game, and in Australia they're not quite the same rules. And you can't have spinning reels, but you can have things that bubble down, and it's just different everywhere around the world, and it's way too complicated. But there really are basically 4 types of wagering, things you could wager on that kind of fit into these buckets. Less germane for the points I'm trying to make. Betting for sports and anything else also can be parimutuel, and because of these various, because there are various types of things, you can get licenses in different places. And again, this is not surprising to this group, so I'm not going to waste a lot of time on it. But when somebody says, well, this is a jurisdiction that's poker only, that sounds really easy and it's a sentence, right? But you have to actually look at the regulation to see what is poker. Poker might be loosely defined as just a ring-based game where people are parimutually betting against each other and the house takes a rake. That's a simple one. Or it could be something very specific. Texas Hold'em poker with the rules of Texas Hold'em. And you don't really know. And so you go to Nevada, poker's a pretty broad definition in Nevada, and there's a lot of opportunities, which nobody's taking advantage of right now, of doing products that meet the regulation of poker, but don't fit the same definition of poker that we're used to. And the reason you would want to do that in Nevada is because of lack of liquidity. It's very difficult to do a lot of high liquidity games in Nevada. So there's definitely opportunities, and I speak to these people. There's a lot of clever people in this room and a lot of clever people in the industry. There are opportunities in real money gambling for things that meet regulation, and you could get through the regulators that would offer completely different experiences, meet the regulation, and get around a lot of the shortcomings of things like liquidity pools. And I'll leave it at that. I'll talk a little bit about one of them in a minute. So problem gambling. Problem gambling comes in because we have to talk about what is problem gambling. Now, I hear people say this all the time, and they say gambling is an addiction. Actually, no. It's not an addiction. Now, it may meet the qualities. I'm going to get right to here. It may meet the consideration of addiction in the minds of people because they think it's something that could destroy your life and it gets very bad and all that, like alcoholism. And in fact, I'm talking about ludomania or problem gambling. The American Psychiatric Association lists it as a compulsive disorder. Now, why does that matter, right? Because laws matter, right? This is the basic thing. The reason it matters most is because, unlike other compulsive disorders, it's not based on what you're doing. So kleptomania is a compulsive disorder. It's listed as a compulsive disorder because you can't help yourself. You have to steal, right? In the case of problem gambling, it's determined by the outcome. Do you do this activity, which is not considered a disorder? Gambling is not a disorder. But do you do it to the point where it affects the rest of your life and destroys your life? That's what defines it as problem gambling. That is actually what it's not an addiction, it's a compulsive disorder. Well, what's interesting about that is you could make that argument, a very strong case against any social game where somebody spent too much money and ruined their life. And it's not a hell of a leap, guys. It's not at all. So we need to pay attention to it because things like gambler's fallacy, martingale systems, all these things that define gambling apply to social games. Not even social casino games. I'm talking about any social game. And so you need to be thinking about the fact that how are you acting as a company? Are you being responsible? Are you watching your whales? Are your whales somebody that has millions of dollars and spends $10,000 a week and can afford it? Or are they somebody that's on a fixed income spending $100 a week and it's basically putting them out on the street? And you have to think about it. And I implore you as an industry, people say, well, the money's good. And look to the gambling industry. Gambling industry does not want addicts, right, if we want to call them addicts. They do not want them. Everybody, I hear this all the time, and the casinos are made by people who lose their shirts and go back to their hometown on a bus. That's fiction. That's not who the casinos want. They don't ever want that outcome. They want you to go, win a little bit of money, feel like a king, spend a bunch of money in the club and at the dinner, and go away having spent 4 times what you thought you were going to spend, but you still could afford it, and coming back again with a smile on your face, ready to do it again. That's what they want. They want you happy. They want your money, but they want you to feel like you got something for it. If nothing else, just some entertainment. I think as a social... Oh, I'm out. Jesus, am I that close already? Sorry, moving too fast. Okay, I got to get to the end here. Wow, that was quick. So I'm out of time, and I didn't even look over there, so I'll skip over the responsible gaming and gaming companies. I do want to go to the conclusions, though, of this. So first is, if you are a social games company or anything contemplating real money gambling, do not write emails about it. Do not talk about it. If you're sitting in a company thinking, I wonder if we're doing gambling, by all means, don't put that in an email. Don't put it in a tweet or a text. I tell everybody I ever talk to, before you write an email, start with the words, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. If you start with those words, you're in the right place, okay? Don't talk about Fight Club. Yeah, attorney-client privilege. But even then, I wouldn't even go for that. So voluntary, and I didn't get to Dean's question, so I do want to do this Q&A if I can, but voluntary regulation of free play casinos is certain. It will happen at some point. And involuntary regulation is likely. Again, voluntary because the casino companies want it, involuntary because the governments will probably force you to do it. And if you want to stay out of being in the gambling participation or gambling side of things, know the rules. If you're a gambling company, you're regulated up the wazoo. You're not going to be able to go anywhere near the gray space. If you're not in the gambling industry, you can get quite close to black, and nobody's going to bother you. And so the minute you open that door, you're basically holding yourself to a much higher standard. So those are kind of the points. I didn't mention the one thing, and I did promise it, so I'm going to mention this really fast. It's entirely possible in that earlier slide to have something that had no consideration, chance, and prize. And so if you can figure out a way to where you can offer an entertainment opportunity absolutely free to everybody and offer real money as a prize, you can actually have risk in the middle. And so there is an option, there is an alternative that has not been done yet that I think is a big opportunity. My Vegas really fast, and I'm done. My Vegas is the reason they get away with that is the prizes that are given away from My Vegas are based solely on time on task. They're not based on any of the outcomes of the games. So your tickets that you get that you earn is just based on time on task, and everybody can play for free. Arguably, because they have pay gates that you have to pay money in to keep playing, they may not be quite as white as you would like, but they are backed by MGM, and they're only regulated in the one state, which is Nevada. And Nevada, to go to MGM and tell MGM you can't do something in Nevada would be very, very difficult politically. They probably couldn't get away with it in the broader scope. I think that's it. I don't think I have time for Q&A, or do I? One or two? I guess we're done. If you have questions, come back to me afterwards. Sorry.